we're going to talk about AUA 2024, where there was a lot of robotic presence, and we want to hear a little bit about your experience. So what did you think about this year's AUA 2024 event?
I think for urologists, this has been a phenomenal year for us. Like, the future is now, right? And so this is the year that not only did we really sort of double down and focus on single port surgery and this whole concept of regionalizing surgery, something we haven't done in any minimally invasive approach ever. In addition, we got the introduction of Da Vinci 5. And with the promise and the ability to actually change the way we learn and we teach surgery through Da Vinci 5, specifically around case insights. And so as a young urologist coming out into the field now, to be able to have access to both of those robotic platforms, single port and Da Vinci 5, I think is extremely exciting and is going to be transformative, not to use that word loosely, but in many ways transformative to our field.
Okay, and on that note, talking about the Da Vinci 5, which is obviously very exciting, as well as the single port, can you walk us through a little bit historically? AUA this year and last year and the last few years has had a very large presence at the AUA, big robotic theater. What was it like when, robotic surgery was first starting? How did it progress?
There's if you even add this to there's something called the adoption curve. And I'm sure you may have seen this. This is something we saw a lot early on, where they have this curve where you have like the early adopters, then you have, everyone sort of shows up, and then at the very end comes the late adopters. So when we started our journey in robotic surgery in 2003, all of us were in the early adopter phase. And there was a lot of skepticism around robotic surgery. A lot of effort was made to transfer surgery from open to laparoscopic. There's some very big names in the field back then: Dr. Arishalov, Dr. Indy Gill, obviously Dr. Clayman, Dr. Landman. A lot of folks were focusing on doing minimally invasive surgery, and it's been a lot of effort doing laparoscopy. When we introduced robotics as a advantage, or as the next obvious transition from laparoscopy to more minimally invasive, there was a lot of pushback. It wasn't necessary. It was adding cost. It was not allowing our surgeons to learn how to do laparoscopy. And there was a lot of dissentment around it. And it was hard, as a young attending, 3-4 years out of training, presenting their work on robotic pyeloplasty, robotic partial nephrectomy, and even the folks presenting on robotic prostatectomy, if you remember back in the day. The open surgeons would be calling them crazy, and there's no data. There's that denial phase, that this is just silly. Then eventually people start to realize and try it themselves. Wait, maybe there's something to it. And now we're 20 years later and everyone's doing it. So there's a little bit of vindication there, I would say, to see all the folks that were sort of throwing, eggs and, tomatoes at you early on, saying you're silly, don't do this, who are now jumped on the bandwagon. They're like, oh, we're all in now. This is great. So there's definitely some vindication, but in the early days, it was hard. And I think money made different reasons. I think Intuitive made it hard. They were sort of used car salesmen. They weren't the company they are today. So they left people with a bad taste in their mouth. I think not having a lot of long-term data on this was also a little bit difficult. And most of us who were doing this, except for people like Dr. Menon, but the majority of us were younger surgeons. And so there wasn't that credibility and validation. Very different today. I think all of us in urology would agree that robotics really has a role and adds significant value.
Yeah, and someone training in the 2020s, it's clear how necessary and the right way robotic surgery is, and how it's moving. So on that note, when taking into single port, there's obviously the same type of curve that exists for single port. And you were part of the single port, the single port masterclass. And I know that there's limitations for when or not a patient is the right fit for single port robotic radical prostatectomy. Can you talk about some of those limitations of the single port platform in a case like that, let's say?
So, I think those limitations are relative to who's doing the surgery, right? And so I'm just going to, before I talk about single port specifically, I do want to just sort of contextually talk about training.
Sure.
So you mentioned this earlier, right? Like training back in the early 2000s, and I think we call the knots, right? Was very different than training now. Training back in the knots was very similar to what it was done 100 years ago, right? You see one, you do one, you teach one, Halstead's model of surgical training. Today, we are fortunate that we've been able to really amplify the way we train people. So seeing one, right? Seeing one back then was you got a CD from Intuitive, you put it on your computer and you watch the video 20 times. Today, you see one, you can go on YouTube, you can go on society websites, you can go on Boxline Box websites, you can go a lot of different places and see a lot of different ways to do it and figure out which one you like.
Yeah.
Training
Experts in surgery as well.
Yes, expertsinsurgery.com is a great place to see, videos that we've created. Then now, in terms of doing one, right? You can do one in a simulator. We now have hydrogel models out of University of Rochester, as well as out of Hopkins, and even companies are now developing like Lazarus. So you can practice the actual surgery you're doing in a hydrogel model, low risk, high fidelity. And then in terms of the feedback you're getting, now that we have Da Vinci 5, we now have not just very easy ways to segment out the case, theater has it as well, but we're getting the data from exactly what I'm doing compared to a resident doing. So training has completely evolved so that the younger generation, should be able to get trained much more efficiently, much more reproducibly, where you're now not requiring 5-10 years to be proficient. Maybe it's a year or two to get proficient because all that extra data that you and feedback you have access to. Single port surgery is not easy in the beginning. But I think there's these learning curves and there's the adoption curves, right? So we were early on the adoption curve. We bought it in 2018. We implemented our program in 2019. Kudos to Mudahar Ahmed, really pushed this envelope, I think, more than any of us here at the hospital. We sort of learned a lot through him. And what we did learn, though, is that it's not for everything. And I don't think Intuitive designed it to be for everything. It's specific to narrow surgery. So it's great in order to get us to regionalize surgery. So for prostatectomy, we now do it extraperitoneally, or we go through the bladder. So we're no longer going to the abdomen. But because of that, there are some limitations. 100-gram prostate, 120-gram prostate, probably not a great way to do it. Someone who's morbidly obese, a lot of fat around the bladder, a lot of fat around the prostate, maybe not the best one to do it in. So for me, I tend to, make sure my patients are either and BMI is less than 31, 35, and prostate 70 cc's or less. So that's sort of my algorithm. Otherwise, I go back to multi-port.
Excellent. And
it's a lot to unpack, but I try to get all that.
That was actually wonderful. And on that note, with the Da Vinci 5 and teaching, so this is new, right? This is not something that we've had where this direct feedback is possible. What can we be looking for in the next coming years with that?
So we're actually in the process of doing a study here at Hackensack University Medical Center, specifically looking at that. And so what we're doing is every single time a resident or fellow sits down at the console, they put in their ID. Every time the surgeon takes over, they put their ID in. And now we are requiring every 2 weeks for the surgeon to do a 30-minute video review with the resident. So that may be how you take down the bladder neck, that may be how you dissect out the hilum, that may be how you do the seminal vesicle dissection. And then through the platform of My Intuitive app, they're going to be able to see what they're doing and what their data coming out is. For example, how long it took you to do that part of the operation, how many times you clutched your camera, how much energy did you use, what were the kinematics, what were your hands doing during the surgery based on a graft. And you're going to be able to compare that to what the expert surgeons did, right? The people that have done a lot of these. And then not only to see just the video what the differences are, but actually granularly what that data is differently. So we can start teaching to them, right? So Dave, you may be someone that just doesn't clutch. Like you may be someone that just sits there the whole time and you're struggling because you're not moving your camera around. So we can figure that out very easily. Oh, Dave, you clutch 4 times, I clutch 50. Let's practice clutching. And maybe we'll give you some exercises to do to get that muscle memory going. Maybe your partner, Chris, he's not, his hands are all over the place, and you look on the graph, his hands are from one end to the other, where my hands are much more, defined in a much more smaller space. So we can create, simulation exercises to get him to be more focused, more, tighter. So I think that what we're going to be able to, and that's what we're going to see is that's the first step. But as AI and the data that we input into the system becomes more and more robust, and we're able to be more validated, I see a point where your hands start moving out of the field. There'll be a warning, like, Dave, your hands are all over the place. Bring them back in. Get tighter. Or maybe there will be a point where you're doing a hysterectomy and you don't find the ureter, and the warning light pops up. You did not define the ureter. You must find the ureter before taking the uterine pedicle. So I think, now it's a lot of data coming back to us. I think the next step is going to be sort of that like lane warning departure system, like, some sort of feedback that you're getting out of the lane. And then maybe, I'm not sure in my lifetime, but maybe it will be automated driving, automated surgery. So it's got to stop somewhere. This is the beginning.
It's really exciting, and obviously there's a lot of new things that can come out of this now. Last question. Do I have time for one more?
Sure.
All right, last one. For young urologists who are starting practice, what are some advice that you would give to them coming out right now?
So collaborate. Okay. So find like-minded individuals who you meet together, even just an hour a month, and share your experiences, share your data, share your challenges together. You will learn so much from collaborating. Collect your own data.
Excellent.
Know your data, because everyone remembers the best patient, everyone forgets the worst patient. So just know your data, analyze it, and share it, and be curious. And whatever we taught you, ignore it all in some ways. I mean, just challenge the norm, right? Challenge the way you've been taught to do it. Challenge the way this is the way it's always been done, and challenge yourself. So challenge yourself. Question authority, keep your data so you know what you're doing, and collaborate with like-minded individuals. And I think you will have a very productive or rewarding career.